thank you very much. Thank you for having me. This is the best coffee I have ever had at a conference. I'm already blown away. So these are some thoughts really around typography and making, and they're part of an extended set of ideas that I've been having, really in response to a lot of debates around design thinking, and an emphasis particularly in education on design thinking. And this quote kind of sums up where I'm at a little bit. This is Petter and Blockland. Where does the thinking of designers come from? That design can be made entirely by thinking in their heads and then solve world problems. It's all about thinking, and none of us are going to make anything. So when I'm in times of design trouble, I often turn to Norman Potter, brilliant book, What is a Designer? Originally written in 1968. And he talks about design as being, yes, the conceiving of an action, but also this fashioning of the means to carry it out, and thinking then about the consequences of those actions as well. So a kind of a three-stage way of thinking and conceiving design. And it's this fashioning. And I think I'm not ready yet to abandon this idea of making and fashioning things to just become purely a strategist. Not least because I'm more than a brain. I'm a brain that's attached to a body, because most of us are. So my perspective, James has just done the most amazing introduction, but who am I and what perspective do I bring to all this? Well, yes, I'm a writer, I'm a teacher, and I'm a designer. So this is a series that I worked on for Penguin under the amazing art direction of David Pearson. So this concern all the time with typography, and one of the things that we're facing at the moment in terms of design, and particularly in typography, is a kind of modern invisibility of typography. There are two problems. There's a problem of scale, and there's an undervaluing of skills. So problem one, of course, we're all now into IDEO, and we're going to change the world. And there's a really big push in education for thinking about societal change. Designers should be involved in the big picture of socially innovative design, and it can be quite tricky in those contexts to be talking about the little things, letters, spacing, kerning, all of the kind of things that rock my world, and they can get a little bit lost, and especially in the educational agenda, because actually one of the things about teaching and education, it's much cheaper to teach generalism than it is to teach specialism. And the undervaluing of skills, just because all my students have access to fonts, they know what they are, and they have computers, doesn't necessarily mean to say that they know what typography is. This is a great quote from Monica Perinder and Colin Davis's book. And they talk about the democracy. Everyone has access. And that's often missing is this understanding that design is actually a sort of a composite set of skilled practices. Helpful, as I've been trying to find my way through this territory, is another book from the late 60s by a ceramicist. So actually that thing about cross-disciplinary and kind of looking to other areas that's already come up this morning is really important. So he's a ceramicist, but thinking a lot about workmanship, really helpful term, if slightly unfortunate because of the gender bias. But it's a kind of helpful way of thinking about. I find it more useful than craft, because craft just gets bogged down in all sorts of really other tricky debates. And he talks about the workmanship of certainty, which is kind of more mass production, when you know how something's going to turn out. But the workmanship of risk, I think, is a really interesting set of ideas. So the idea that the quality of something is constantly up for grabs as you're working on it and is open to change. That's a really helpful concept when we're starting to think about what it is when we're thinking about making. So this difficulty of articulating workmanship in typography comes back to this problem of invisibility. And again, sort of my frustrations in my world, because after all, anyone can do what we do. Heads of companies can just draw their own logos. Hell, why not? So that'll be how that makes me feel. And then David Pye again. So unless workmanship comes to be understood and appreciated for the art that it is, our environment will lose much of the quality it still retains. So a lot of, and this is a great quote by Laura Potter, another ceramicist actually, from a great essay, Hand and Brain by Beacon Northam. She put together an anthology of people thinking about craft practices. And this sort of wider maker illiteracy, a lack of understanding of where things have come from, and that lack of understanding of where things have come from is leading to this lack of understanding of how things should be differently valued because of this not understanding the kind of trajectory of making practices. So a lot of that came together in something I wrote for iMagazine, kind of graphic design magazine, in their issue 94. But today, I kind of really wanted to think a little bit about letters and an understanding of where they come from. It's kind of why James asked me. And anyone who knows me or follows me on Twitter will know just how much I like letters. So I'm just going to focus on 3 examples, like touch on 3 stories associated with 3 things. And yes, interesting looking, one of those will be letterpress. So lettering is the first example. And I say lettering, not type, because actually understanding the difference between lettering and type matters. And again, it's a story of making. So this is in Queen Square in Bloomsbury in London, the Royal London Homeopathic Hospital, and it's a really good demonstration of the difference between type and lettering. So at one time, this was the good old-fashioned The London Homeopathic Hospital, and then some king probably got involved, and it had to become the Royal London Homeopathic Hospital. If you look at London Homeopathic and Hospital, you'll see classic problem there of one very long word to be balanced against shorter words. This is lettering, it's site-specific, and the person who's worked on this in ceramics has understood that fundamental problem. The O's in homeopathic are narrower than the O's in the other letter. Not too much, so it's really obvious, but there's a balance, an attempt to balance these word shapes against each other in that particular configuration. When they've come and put the royal in, they've just stuck a typeface. So it has that kind of static feel, and it doesn't blend. It's not at all the right letter, but it just has this kind of, it doesn't have the flexibility or the site specificity that's really fundamental to what lettering is. If you grasp that fundamental difference, then you start to open up possibilities for what lettering can do. The idea of richness, the flexibility, and avoiding the standardization and sterility of type. It's what makes type work really well on the computer, the fact that it is standard. And you need a systematic approach in terms of wayfinding systems, but often buildings need something which is a lot more giving. And like I say, once you understand that, amazing things can happen or not. So this would be an example of an amazing thing that can happen. This is the absolutely bonkers Michelin house on Fulham Road. And every inch of this building has been dedicated to the possibilities of what lettering can do to reinforce the story of Bibendum and Michelin. So there are there's lettering in the windows, there's beautiful use of ceramic lettering in 3 dimensions on every kind of corner, it's making use of faience and the kind of shine. All sorts of different techniques are coming together. You cannot separate lettering and building, it's all one fabulous whole. More subtle, but still extraordinary. This is the Sainsbury wing for the National Gallery in London. So this is just off Trafalgar Square. The architect Robert Venturi commissioned Michael Harvey, probably one of the finest letter cutters we've ever had in the UK, probably in the world, to carve an inscription of the names of the artists. And you walk up the stairs and it's on your left. He understands the situation of that of where that frieze was going to be. It's not that well lit. And he understood the trajectory of the sun and how it was going to move across the space during the day. And when you're there, the letters are very deeply cut in the stone, making the most of the light. And if you stand there and watch them, literally, the kind of curves and the flicks of the shapes moving around the letters is monumentally beautiful and very well considered. It's kind of brings a liveliness to the wall. So this is somebody really understanding and handling the materials and the letters very well, and it goes back to this idea of richness and site specificity. Or, if you're Norman Foster, you say, I'm going to use my corporate typeface, which is Rotis, and I'm just going to get an Italian foundry to carve it with a machine flat and run it around the top of the building. There's the typeface, there's the inscription. It has none of the presence, it has none of the material sensibility or sensitivity. It doesn't work with the light in a way that if you had got somebody who actually knew and understood what lettering is, could have done in the same situation. And don't get me started on that building in Cardiff with its horrible, horrible lettering. So these are cautionary tales about what some understanding of letterform can do. So one of the things that I have to do as a tutor, I don't have to do it, it's my pleasure to do it, is to try to communicate to my students something about the language of letterforms, because I'm trying to help them make sense of the big old mess that is the world of fonts. So if you just type font into Google, which I did the other night, you just get all sorts of weird shit. Creative, bubble, gangster, royal, all sorts of, like I said. And it's all very touchy-feely. The language, there's so many typefaces now that the market has really shifted to well, how do I make you feel? And actually, I'm not so interested in how a typeface makes me feel. I don't want typefaces to be my friends. They can't buy me beer. I want typefaces as tools, and actually to understand typefaces as tools, I want to understand how they've been made and what they are bringing as shapes and forms to my work. And actually understanding some of the shapes is a little bit about understanding some of their origins and previous technologies. So understanding a little bit about different pens used to write, and some of those shapes have been frozen and absorbed into typeface design. It's not that every typeface starts life like this, far from it, but there's a language which we have definitely inherited and passed on and continues into typefaces that we have on our laptops every day. And particularly this idea of the broad edge pen. So this is the weirdness that was me rocking up on the TV over the summer and thinking and talking a little bit about Edward Johnston and understanding his approach to teaching, which was to understand students about the tool and the pen. And I did a little trick with two pieces of chalk, which you tie together, and you can kind of recreate the effect of the broad edge pen, or you can use a piece of balsa wood and you sand away one edge. And then you do this. Apologies to calligraphy. I am no calligrapher. I am abusing the art of calligraphy to make a point. But you can kind of recreate quite effectively the idea of the broad edge pen. This is Edward Johnston's worksheet, which is what James is using on the conference or the publicity on the site. What's really lovely is his handwriting at the bottom. So that at the top it looks quite fresh and modern, and then we actually have his calligraphic approach, which results in square commas, square, because if you're working with a broad edge pen, that's why you end up with these particular shapes. And this was me photographing this at Turnpike Lane Tube Station as I got off on the way home from work. And you can see exactly that, the influence in the kind of comma. So understanding a little bit about tool and why typefaces look the way that they do. One more. So this is, I'm just working out the proportions of the width of the pen that I'm using to the size of the letter. So if you've ever wondered why letters, the thick bits of them are in the position that they are, and the thin bits comes down to this is how if you write the shape with a pen, you get this distribution of thick and thin shapes, which gets frozen and borrowed within typefaces. So I run the workshop with my students. Some of the results, it kind of generates some really interesting shapes and forms as they start to get braver and play. But of course, this isn't just about accruing arcane knowledge just to impress. Big University Challenge fan. It's about understanding the strengths and weaknesses of typefaces, so understanding where they come from, because that idea about the distribution of the thicks and thins it means that certain typefaces are more suitable for certain kind of roles and jobs and tasks than other ones are, and you can start to read that language, so understanding. So this is a poster that's appearing everywhere, and actually when you start to look at those little things that I did, those little videos, and you start to think about where all the weight is here, and you start to think about shapes like this, you can understand that there's a pen having this influence and at work here. But it's also because the people who I find that are most interested in how things were made make the most interesting makers. And this is what Anil was saying at the beginning, that it's not just about sustaining something as a dead practice, but it's about always innovating. So Peter van Blokland, whose typeface this is somebody who would have been schooled in how to cut letters in stone as well as make them in pens. But he's also an amazing, I'd say, a kind of craft coder in terms of generating letters. And then finally, just to kind of think a little bit about letterpress and follow on a little bit from the last presentation. Typography is not just about letter forms, it's about space as well, and about how the two come together. And all of my first-year students will run through a letterpress workshop. We still have that facility at Central St Martin's where I teach. So we do hand setting. So you literally, letter by letter, you put them all together, because it reveals something really fundamental and essential about the modularity of how type has to literally fit together. And although we overcome that and work with that differently on the computer, it's actually very, very similar. But it also communicates an essential thing, which is the idea that space is as important in a composition. So this is a poster I did. I worked on for a Brazilian restaurant chain here. So in the poster, I've got this huge letter, and I have some letters here. And here, I wanted white space. Well, I had to add metal. It doesn't print, but you have to add it into the layout physically. The space isn't just a sort of substrate on which the letters float. It's a kind of an element, and you're working in a point of tension between letter form and space. So that's how it prints, and you can see the white space, which had to be physically added into the design. So my worry with letterpress is I'm not sure that the sort of letterpress as designer therapy is that sustainable. I worry that it's a fashion, and I worry that it's a reaction to digital. And I also slightly worry about the kind of retro cul-de-sac that it's found itself in, because I'm not sure, again, that that's particularly sustainable. So it's as though there's a process, and there's a fascination with a process, but I'm not so convinced always of the purpose. But I think there are people who are starting to do some interesting things. But again, two cautionary and really nice quotes. This is Bill Gibson talking about the fetishization of craftsmanship and the idea of producing status objects, and that kind of niche letterpress market I'm slightly wary of. That nostalgia is the deadliest enemy of history, and it's not the road forward to innovation. And this again is the lovely Norman Potter, who says that spirit or attitude are as important as method and technique, and we need to have the two together. Otherwise, we just end up with a kind of sterility, or he calls it very, very nicely, pretentious emptiness, be that in educational or professional practice. This is Lottomatica. They're a gang of very lovely designers and illustrators in Barcelona that took over a local print shop. Interestingly, they kept the printer. They all paid in as a not-for-profit, and they've kept him going, and he's trained them. What they've managed to do is they've managed to work out how to do something interesting with the print shop. So they're working as a local print shop for local change, and they're very, very interested in the content that they're working with, not just the process. So they've been producing some political pamphlets and leaflets. So this was 2011, anti-corruption, able to produce very high quality and very quick and immediate kind of publications, which they could then distribute, and people went on the demonstrations and marches. So this idea of having a printing press, and the idea of what a printing press really represents in terms of having a voice, that's what it represented in the 1450s, the dissemination of information, and what having a printing press really means now, not making knickknacks, but actually making things as an agent for social change. Matthew Crawford in The World Beyond Your Head talks about how skilled practices are this kind of point of connection to the world, an anchor to the world beyond one's head, and this kind of connection to society, other people who have a reality of their own. And I guess in conclusion, some people will say that all of my preoccupations with typography, with lettering, with letterform, with letterpress are about taste making. But actually for me, it's about understanding making, of thinking about making, and not just thinking as an end in itself, and where that might lead. And as Jan van Toorn would suggest, it leads to a more truly human existence when thinking and making are far better aligned. Thank you.